bottom line.
I'm going to repeat the definition of apartheid. To begin, apartheid is defined by the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court as inhumane acts of character similar to crimes against humanity, quote, committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over any other racial group or groups, and committed with the intention of maintaining that regime. This is a good definition of apartheid, a word that comes from the Afrikaans word for separation. As we all know today, in South Africa, the white minority of the country systematically committed a crime on the majority black population of that country from 1948 to 1993, as was enforced by the National Party government. These laws imposed segregation and never made an attempt to even make a separate but equal set of laws for the nation. The message of apartheid was clear at the time from the National Party and the whites that agreed with the brutal and oppressive regime system that kept blacks in subordinate positions, ensuring their systematic abuse. You may outnumber us, but we will not interact with or tolerate you because we as a race are superior. I find it embarrassing that such a system existed in the world I live in while I was still alive. I've since discovered many more other embarrassing things about the world I live in, but today the issue is apartheid. Within the previous stated definition is the bulk of my argument against the charge and accusation of apartheid against the state of Israel that so many seem to be making in increasing numbers. Let's first go to the word racial. In order for one nation to be enforcing apartheid within a population of its own country or a neighboring state or territory, there must be one race clearly pitted against another and expressing its constant dominance over it. This is not the case in Israel by any stretch of the imagination. It is easy to see how some in Europe and North America may be led by the false impression that the Jews are a white race, but that belief has no grounding in reality. To begin with, being Jewish is an ethnicity and a religion, but not a race. Yes, there are plenty of white European Jews, and they have arguably suffered in recent history through one of the most vicious and violent genocides in the history of mankind. But there are also many other races that a Jew could come in. In the diaspora, when the Jews were forced out of their homeland, the Jewish people dispersed seemingly to every corner of the world. The young nation has made a magnificent and laudable attempt to unite the tribe, nation, and people of Israel. The result is a multicultural fusion of races, cultures, and beliefs in a unique way that the world most assuredly has not seen before. If you want to call Israel an apartheid state, I believe there must be an asterisk or fine print somewhere that says, but not the racist kind. Do not believe anybody that wants you to believe the stereotype of today's Jew or Israeli of being an imperialist looking to inflict pain and suffering on Arab people for their own intents and purposes, regardless of who gets hurt along the way. It is not an accurate image. Israel is a hybrid of blacks, Arabs, whites, Persians, Latinos, and Asians, all of which are Jews, by the way, while maintaining a nearly 20% Muslim population of 1.4 million. You will not find a better track record for multiculturalism in any Arab country. The demographics of the state simply do not hold up to the apartheid accusation because Israel is not a white country looking to preserve its whiteness like the South African apartheid regime was. But that is certainly the implication. Is there racism within Israel itself? Without looking it up, I think I can be almost sure of it. But it is minuscule compared to most other countries in the world. And overall, I think the argument could be made that different races get along better in Israel than in America. Decades ago, racism was a larger problem in Israel. But today, overall, it has almost reached the point of being a non-issue through intermarriage and increased immigration. If anything, the Israelis could teach the other nations in the world a thing or two about integration, equality, and better immigration programs to create a more cohesive and productive society amongst different races and cultures. The second part of the definition mentioned earlier entails that the dominant race is committed to the regime. Israel is a free and open liberal democracy that is flawed but still laudable. Many defenders of Israel believe that in ideological and philosophical terms, that some of Israel's greatest enemies are other Jews or Israelis themselves that constantly attempt to undermine the state through their often harsh and sometimes unrelenting criticisms. But in Israel, there is freedom of speech and freedom of press, among many others. This means that, like in America, no matter how misleading or manipulative I think an opponent may be or their views, I will always defend their right to say what they believe, no matter how destructive I think their words may be. Israel is not a regime, and therefore no one that cares about Israel can be committed to a regime. It would also be foolish for the general population not to overall be critical of Israel, and some of its leading newspapers and academics are the world's foremost critics on Israeli policy. Criticism is how things ultimately get better and improve. I don't believe that the apartheid thing is a criticism, though, but rather a calculated political tactic by those that assert it. Don't take my word for it, though. There's a video on YouTube that I encourage everybody to watch that can be found on honestreporting.com, in which Judy Rebert says, and I'm quoting now, "There's the brilliance, the propaganda brilliance of calling Israel an apartheid state." She went on to say, because every time these people put a motion through Parliament and through the legislature, or try to shut you down in other ways, they have to say Israel isn't an apartheid state. They have to say it's hate talk to say Israel's an apartheid state. Each time they say it, Rebecca went on. So over time, it really is a brilliant propaganda tactic, because each time it becomes more familiar, something that is forbidden by the mainstream becomes a familiar word. And there we have it. Now, I do believe that Rebecca, who is Jewish, by the way, believes herself that Israel is an apartheid state, and that this idea must become mainstream and recognized by any means necessary, even if that entails stretching the definition of apartheid out so thinly that nearly every nation in the world with some sort of segregation system could be labeled apartheid. For propagandists like Ms. Rebick, the end is so good, so pure, that the means are justified by default, even if that means propaganda must be one of the many tools we use at your disposal in accomplishing the mission. The strategy's intent is clear and plainly stated. It is simple word association on the basis of it. Every time you see the words Israel and apartheid next to each other, they become entangled and associated with each other. Now, to address some of the finer points of the apartheid analogy that are most commonly used. The wall. The wall has been built along the West Bank, and one of the main accusations hurled against Israel to justify the apartheid invasion. Built mainly along the green line of the 1949 Armistice Agreement, with around 12% of the West Bank area on the Israeli side. The wall is a fence built by Israel with the intention of preventing terrorist attacks. Has it worked? The answer is undoubtedly yes. When the first contiguous section of the wall was created in July 2003, there were 73 Palestinian suicide bombings that killed 293 Israelis and seriously injured 1900 others from the end of the Second Intifada. No nation on earth has to accept numbers like these. During the 11 months of construction, only 3 suicide bombing attacks were carried out successfully. Since the fence was constructed, attacks have decreased by 90%. The wall did what the Israelis said it would do, and it's worked. It's not a coincidence that the attacks went down at such an alarming rate after the completion of the wall's construction. 521 suicide bombing attacks reported by the Israeli Defense Forces from 2000 to 2006. 540 Israelis were killed by suicide bombing during this time. Suicide bombing has ceased for nearly 5 years. The occupation of the Palestinian territories and continued expansion of Jewish settlements is often cited as the main evidence for overall Israeli racism and apartheid. The occupation is a result of a war that Israel won in 1967 when several of its neighboring Arab states attempted to provoke and build up a regional conflict. Though Israel struck first and preemptively, it was a response to a massive military buildup along its Egyptian border, and in relative world history terms, fought one of the quickest and cleanest wars in history. It was not a war that the Israelis wanted, and many Israelis were surprised about the outcome themselves. Many were expecting a loss that would have entailed the destruction of the state and would have resulted in thousands of civilian deaths and massacres. Instead, Israel united Jerusalem and won a war because of its superior planning, strategy, and mobilization. At no point did the Israelis think about race as a factor in occupying the West Bank, Gaza, or the Sinai, which they eventually returned to Egypt. There are consequences for being on the losing side in wars. These areas have always been important to Jews, and Hebron in the West Bank is considered the birthplace of Judaism and the second holiest city after Jerusalem. Some Jews should live in these parts of the world and should be allowed access to them, just as some Arabs and Palestinians should be able to live in parts of Greater Jerusalem, which they can.